Have you ever been home alone and felt watched? The kind of sensation where you're sure someone or something is lurking just beyond your sight? The stillness of an empty house. Yet every sound seems too loud. Every shadow seems too dark. Let me take you through some chilling, true stories of being home alone that might make you think twice about your next night in. Story 1. The Whispering Shadows. Sarah was no stranger to late nights. As a freelance writer, her apartment was her sanctuary. The city's hum and distant car horns were the soundtrack to her evenings, and she often worked late into the night undisturbed. She lived alone in a modest apartment on the third floor of an old, weathered building in the city center. The creaking of the wooden floors and the sound of the pipes groaning from time to time were familiar noises she had grown accustomed to. But tonight felt different. She couldn't explain it, but something about the stillness felt off. The apartment, usually comforting in its solitude, suddenly felt too quiet, too oppressive. Sarah pushed the uneasy feeling to the back of her mind, blaming it on the stress of the deadline she was facing. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at her desk, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. It was exactly 3:07 a.m. when it happened. The first whisper came out of nowhere. It was faint, like the rustling of a leaf outside her window, but Sarah was sure she heard it. A whisper. Sarah. Her heart skipped. She paused, listening. The apartment was silent again, except for the hum of her computer. She stood up from her chair, walking toward the living room. The shadows from the streetlights outside filtered into the blinds, casting strange shapes across the walls. Everything looked normal, but as she walked back to her desk, she saw something, just a fleeting glimpse. A shadow moved across the hallway, too fast to be caught in her peripheral vision. She stopped dead in her tracks. The shadow was no bigger than a person, but there was something wrong about it. It didn't belong. Her pulse quickened, and her hands trembled. She turned back toward her desk, telling herself it was just her mind playing tricks, a result of overwork and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The whisper came again, louder this time. Sarah, Sarah. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the bedroom door, barely ajar. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. Her entire body tensed, as if her senses were on high alert. She quickly grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, hoping to shake off the feeling. But the call didn't go through. The screen froze. The call wouldn't even connect. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the room felt colder, despite the fact that the heater had been running all night. The air around her felt dense, heavy. Sarah was no longer alone. She could feel it. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate scraping noise, coming from the hallway. It was like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard, distant but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. She rushed to the hallway, but as soon as she reached it, the sound stopped. The hallway was empty, but the feeling, it didn't go away. Sarah tried to shake it off, forcing herself to move quickly through her apartment, checking every room, every corner, but the whispers followed her. They were getting louder, more insistent. Sarah, Sarah. The voice was right behind her now, as if breathing down her neck. In a panic, she ran to the front door, but before she could reach it, she froze. There, standing at the entrance to the hallway, was a shadow, long and thin, stretching unnaturally across the floor. It was a figure, tall and distorted, its features completely obscured by darkness. It didn't move, just stood there, staring at her. The whisper came one last time, sharp and clear. Sarah, help me. And then silence. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind her. She didn't care about her things, her work, or the apartment she had called home for so long. She just needed to leave. The next morning, Sarah decided to return to her apartment, convinced that she had been imagining things. But as soon as she walked into the building, she was met with a chilling revelation. The landlord informed her that the previous tenant, an elderly woman named Mrs. Walker, had passed away years ago. What was even more disturbing was the fact that she had been found just outside Sarah's apartment, in the hallway, lying motionless as if she had been trying to get back inside. The building management had been trying to sell the apartment for months, but always fell through. People refused to move in, reporting strange noises, the sound of whispers, and the unsettling feeling that someone was still watching them. Sarah hadn't wanted to believe it, but now she had no choice. Could it be that the voice she heard, the whisper that followed her, was that of Mrs. Walker, still trapped in the very place she had died? Was Sarah's experience simply the product of her stressed mind, or was it the restless spirit of a woman who refused to leave her apartment? Now, what do you think? Could Sarah have been haunted by the ghost of Mrs. Walker, or was it something far darker and more ancient? Have you ever heard a whisper in the dark that you couldn't explain? Leave your thoughts below and stay tuned. There's more where that came from. Story 2, The Locked Door. Jake had always preferred the solitude of his rural home. A 35-year-old contractor, he had spent most of his life working with his hands, building and fixing things. His house was simple, nestled on the outskirts of a small, quiet town, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. It was a perfect place for someone who needed peace, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. He lived alone, having never married, content with his solitude, or so he thought. One night, after a long, grueling shift on a construction site, Jake returned home around midnight, feeling the weight of exhaustion in every muscle. The dark, winding roads were deserted, save for the occasional flicker of his headlights illuminating the trees that lined his path. The air was cool, crisp, and carried the faint smell of pine. He parked his truck in front of his house, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he stepped out. The house was still. It was always still at night, the only sounds being the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the distant hum of the wind. Jake let out a sigh of relief, looking forward to a warm meal and some much-needed rest. He stepped inside, kicking off his boots and locking the door behind him. Something was off. As he stepped further into the hallway, he immediately noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. Jake had always kept that door locked, never wanting to go down there unless absolutely necessary. It had been that way since he moved in, a habit he never broke. But tonight, the door was cracked open, just enough for the faintest sliver of darkness to peek through. A chill ran down his spine. Jake wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He walked closer to the basement door, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. The smell of damp earth seemed to seep from the crack in the door, mingling with the usual scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavier, thicker than it should have been. He reached for the doorknob, and just as his fingers brushed it, he heard something. A low growl, almost like an animal, but not quite. It was deeper, unsettling in a way he couldn't explain. It came from the basement, and it sent a wave of cold fear coursing through him. Jake stepped back quickly, his heart pounding. Was it an animal? A raccoon, perhaps, or a stray dog that had found its way in? But the growl was too guttural, too unnatural to be anything like that. His instincts screamed at him to get out of the house, but he stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize what he had just heard. He glanced at the door, which was still slightly open, as if inviting him in. The growl came again, louder this time, accompanied by a scraping sound, like claws dragging across concrete. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He bolted for the front door, but as he moved through the hallway, he felt a strange shift in the air. The house, which had felt so familiar, now felt suffocating, oppressive. The growl stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Jake's breath quickened as he reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle was stuck. Panic rose in his chest as he struggled with the door, the scraping sound from the basement growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind him. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and he rushed outside, slamming it shut behind him. He didn't look back. His heart pounded in his ears as he sprinted to his truck, throwing the keys into the ignition and speeding away without a second thought. The next day, Jake returned to the house, determined to find an explanation. But when he approached the basement door, he froze. It was closed tightly. No sign of the crack that had been there the night before. He checked the locks, the windows. Everything seemed secure, as if nothing had happened. But there was something he couldn't shake. The feeling that something had been in that basement. Something that didn't belong. Later, when he asked around the town, he learned the house's unsettling history. The previous owner had vanished without a trace. The police had searched for months, but they never found a single clue. The strange part? Neighbors reported hearing noises late at night, like something or someone was moving around inside the house, long after the previous owner had disappeared. Jake never felt safe in that house again. He sold it soon after, never returning. But to this day, he can't shake the feeling that something in that basement is still waiting. Could it have been the ghost of the missing owner, or was there something far darker lurking in the house? Something that had been awakened when Jake stepped inside? What do you think? Was Jake truly haunted by the spirit of the previous owner? Or was there something even more sinister hidden beneath the house? Have you ever felt like something was waiting for you, just out of sight? Share your thoughts in the comment below, and stay tuned for more terrifying true stories. Story 3, The Midnight Visitor. Lena had always thought of her home as a safe haven. It was an old house, nestled at the end of a quiet street, with a sprawling yard and trees that shaded the property in the summer. She'd lived there for over a decade, and despite its age and creaks, the house had always been a peaceful refuge after long days of work. But one night, everything changed. It was just past midnight when Lena returned home from a late shift at the hospital. The road leading up to her house was completely deserted. The only sound the crunch of her car tires on the gravel driveway. She turned off the engine, but as she stepped out of the car, she noticed something odd. The porch light, which was usually off, was glowing brightly. "That's strange," Lena muttered to herself, her eyebrows furrowing in confusion. She had lived alone for years and always made sure the porch light was off at night. Perhaps the switch had been left on, or maybe it was just the wind that caused it to flicker on. But when she stepped onto the porch, the door creaked open slightly. Lena froze. The door was supposed to be locked. She always checked it before leaving for work. But tonight, the lock had been mysteriously undone. She felt a surge of unease, but dismissed it as her mind playing tricks. She figured she might have forgotten to double-check it in her tired state. She stepped inside, and immediately a wave of cold air hit her. The warmth of the house felt foreign, as if it had been cold for hours. Lena shrugged it off, deciding she was just exhausted from the shift. But as she made her way through the hallway, something caught her eye. A shadow darted across the wall in the living room. just a fleeting movement, but enough to make her stop dead in her tracks. She turned toward the living room, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, save for the furniture that had always been in place. Still, something felt wrong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a door creaking, coming from the upstairs hallway. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She had checked every door and window before leaving earlier that day. Everything had been locked. Yet now, a door upstairs was clearly opening. "Hello," Lena called out, her voice shaky, though she knew no one was supposed to be there. Silence. Lena swallowed hard. She slowly made her way toward the stairs, her pulse racing in her ears. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, the silence growing more suffocating with every move. The cold air was getting stronger as she reached the top of the stairs, and as she turned the corner of the hallway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The door to her bedroom was wide open. This was impossible. She had left it closed when she left. The light in the room flickered, as if something was disturbing the air inside. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she slowly approached the door, her hands trembling at her sides. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to enter the room. The room was empty. Her bed was still made. The curtains swayed gently as the breeze from the open window made them flutter. But the unease in the pit of her stomach was unbearable. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. A presence lingered in the room, as if someone had just been there. That's when she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the room, near the window. It was tall, too tall to be anyone Lena recognized. The figure stood motionless, its back to her, as if waiting for her to approach. Lena's breath caught in her throat, her legs refusing to move. But then, as if sensing her presence, the figure slowly turned around. Lena couldn't make out its features, only a silhouette against the dim light coming from a window, but she could feel its eyes on her, even though its face was obscured. Before she could react, the figure vanished, gone in an instant, leaving only the cold emptiness behind. Lena ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood on the porch, gasping for air. The night was silent again, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next morning, Lena called a friend to come over. Together, they searched the house, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No open windows, no signs of forced entry. Everything was as it should be, but the memory of that figure, standing silently in her bedroom, haunted Lena. A few days later, Lena learned that the house had a history. The previous owner, a man named Arthur, had lived there alone for many years before passing away under strange circumstances. He had been found in the upstairs bedroom, his body cold, but with no visible signs of trauma. Neighbors had reported seeing strange shadows in the windows at night, but no one could ever explain it. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the presence in her home was connected to Arthur, lingering in the place where he had died. And no matter how many times she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't deny that something or someone was still there waiting. Was the figure Lena saw just a figment of her imagination, or had Arthur's restless spirit returned to the place he once called home? Do you believe in the spirits of those who have passed, or do you think Lena's mind simply played tricks on her? Have you ever encountered something or someone when you were home alone that you couldn't explain? Leave your thoughts in the comment below, and stay tuned for more terrifying true stories.